Hello, everybody, and welcome back. And I hope everyone's had the chance to stretch your legs, maybe grab a coffee, and also, as I mentioned at the end of that last session, to check out some of the on-demand sessions that we have running. And there's plenty more time for that later. Those are going to be running for the whole duration of the 2 days. But next, we're moving on to our next session. Now, one of the issues that came up in that first discussion, particularly towards the end of the discussion there, was the issue of spectrum sharing. A key issue, of course, and we're delighted to now have a panel that's going to be focusing specifically on that, looking at innovative new technology and policy thinking in the area. So to tell you more and to introduce the issues and our panelists, I'd now like to welcome to the stage Rob Yates. Rob from LeMay Yates Associates. So Rob, welcome. Great to have you with us. Yeah, really interesting topic, that was spectrum sharing. So yeah, looking forward to this panel. I know you're going to introduce some of the issues and then bring our panelists up. So I'll pass over to you. Looking forward to it.
All right, appreciate it. Thanks, Dan. Good morning, everyone. Great to be here. The spectrum sharing panel. If we can bring the slide up, and we'll kick it off. So welcome. So we're talking about maximizing the potential of spectrum sharing, innovative new technology and policy thinking. Don't think this is a dull topic. This is going to be a great panel. And if we could move to the next chart. Just to give you a quick background, you'll be hearing from us at this conference. My partner, Joanne LeMay, is doing a session this afternoon on the RDOF, so we may or may not touch on that here. We're a consulting firm. We do a lot of work in spectrum and auction areas, and lately on broadband subsidy. So the famous RDOF auction we're involved in, and other reverse subsidy auctions. And as was discussed in the previous session, some of the trade-offs between wireless and wireless deployment in that context, and what the implications are for wireless. And of course, that also has an implication for spectrum sharing, which is also part of the overall dialogue. So that's a quick overview of where we're coming from. If we can move to the next chart. My introduction will be really quick because I want to make sure everyone gets a chance to speak. But I thought I'd set out, the conference organizers put some words on the website of what the context of this topic is. I thought I'd just highlight sort of some of the key points or themes. I guess first and foremost is understanding a framework. What do we mean by sharing? Obviously, sharing is kind of an overused word since it applies to licensed, unlicensed. It applies to dynamic sharing versus like a database approach, dipping and finding out what's going on versus coordination. We've had sharing of frequencies practically since frequencies existed, since some applications can work at the same time as others using the same frequencies. So there's technical coordination, band sharing. So I use, part of it, or I use it for a certain time of day. And then, of course, there's all the innovations around that and how sharing fits into the broader spectrum policy. So segueing from the earlier discussion. We see it, and I think we can certainly have that conversation. The US is sort of leading, at least in the role of, in the context of dynamic sharing, particularly with CBRS. We hear a lot about CBRS. Hopefully, our Verizon representative on the panel, who has a lot of work in CBRS and in using of shared and dedicated spectrum, can give us that. How the U.S. is positioned in spectrum sharing. Now, I want to add very quickly and just be very clear. I don't know if someone's mentioned it already, but obviously the FCC auction 110 is ongoing. So even though there are sharing discussions around that band, the 3450 to 3550, we will not be talking about that. We're in the quiet period for that auction. And so there will be absolutely no conversation around that, other than perhaps oblique references to sharing mechanisms. We should look at other approaches around the world. The UK has a different approach from Germany. We'll maybe touch on that, how different ways of sharing, how they impact use of frequencies and the value and the economic value. And then, of course, the practical experience, high power, low power, the ultra wideband approaches, indoor, outdoor, smart devices detection versus informing. So there's tons of stuff to talk about. And we'll go to the next chart. And we have a fantastic panel to go through all these points, and we'll start with, we'll take till about noon, but everyone has a brief presentation to start with. So we'll go through those. We'll gather questions on the chat part of the site and do the questions after everyone's had their chance to speak. And we'll be starting hearing from the FCC, then the NTIA, the UWB Alliance with Tim Harrington, then Martha from DSA, and finishing with Patrick from Verizon. So that that's our panel. We're ready to go. And I think if we want to bring up Ron as our first speaker, Ron is the chief of the Office of Engineering Technology at the FCC. There's some good bio notes on him. I assume you're replacing Julie Knapp, who we all know and love from previous conferences here. Ron has over 25 years of experience. He's been a number of international forums, the ITU, the WRCs, and is an expert in spectrum sharing and satellite versus terrestrial and things. So over to you, Ron. And if you want to add other words of your intro bio, that'd be great.
Well, thank you, Rob. And actually,
a
little more than 29 years. So the time is going very quickly. It says a couple things. One, I must really love my job if I stayed in the same place for 29 years, and I really do. It's a great place to be at the Federal Communications Commission and to see so many changes when it comes to RF spectrum management and the such. It's just a great place to be, and it's great to see the changes in technology as we go through another generation. We heard the acting chairwoman talking about 6G and what the commission is doing to position itself to deal with the changes from a 6G perspective. So quite a lot of work going on. But good morning, and it's a pleasure to be here with you, and thank you for the invitation to speak this morning and to be on this panel. Over the past week, I've been traveling quite a lot by plane. And on one leg of my flight to the West Coast, the flight attendant announced as we were settling in for a 3-hour flight that the Wi-Fi would not be available. There was a loud groan from the passengers, as you can imagine, and we were all thinking about the same thing. What are we going to do if there's no connectivity for 3 hours? I wonder if the same groan from us passengers would have happened if the captain instead said, well, but we're going to be delayed for 45 minutes, but the Wi-Fi is going to be fully operational. Might have been a different reaction from the passengers. I say that somewhat jokingly, but if you stop to think about it, you probably used no less than 10 wireless devices this morning. And I'm not just referring to mobile devices and wireless routers. Think of the smart appliances and home automation controls that you may have used this morning. Is there a medical device that you rely on to send information to your physician wirelessly? If you drove a vehicle this morning, did you get it out of the garage using a garage door opener or key fob to start the car? If you used a credit card to purchase something, did you use the RFID chip inside the card to make that purchase? To say the least, wireless connectivity is a big part of our daily lives. In fact, we're all conducting business now for this virtual event using wireless devices and networks in some form or fashion. We wireless broadband consumers don't necessarily care whether we connect via satellite or terrestrial means, licensed or unlicensed, but whether we're in an urban core or a remote rural home or on a plane, we depend on wireless devices and networks to connect with one another. And access to radio frequency spectrum is a vital part to meeting the demands of the American public. The FCC has placed a considerable amount of low band, mid-band, and high-band spectrum into the marketplace. And having a mix of RF spectrum in the marketplace positions wireless broadband operators to offer the services and applications that the American public demands. RF spectrum portfolios are important to optimize coverage and capacity. Radio frequency propagation properties differ for various spectrum ranges. Mid-band and high-band spectrum, for example, are well suited to maximize frequency reuse, and larger bandwidths lead to greater capacity. Mid-band and low-band spectrum is more conducive to coverage. You probably noticed the commonality for coverage and capacity is mid-band spectrum, hence the FCC's emphasis on getting more mid-band spectrum into the marketplace. We heard the acting chairwoman this morning mention several important activities that are ongoing at the Commission with respect to mid-band. These include CBRS, C-band, 3450 megahertz, 6 gigahertz, 5.9 gigahertz, 4.9 gigahertz, and now the focus on spectrum below 3450 megahertz. Wireless broadband operators are building networks to bring network connections closer to consumers. And as a result, the RF spectrum is becoming more congested as wireless carriers densify their networks. The mid-band's no exception. There are technical challenges that arise when promoting more intensive use of the spectrum. As spectrum is repurposed, the networks are densified. There are spectrum adjacencies that need to be carefully evaluated. Sharing environments need to be carefully evaluated as well when incumbent operations remain in the repurposed spectrum. Now, there are basically 4 ways to share RF spectrum: through frequency and geographic separation, through differences in permitted power levels, and by time sharing. Traditional spectrum sharing is static in nature when frequency and geographic separation are used to promote the sharing. For example, one example is one that served us for many decades, and that is satellite and terrestrial microwave links sharing the same spectrum allocations on a primary basis. A dynamic approach to sharing spectrum includes the time sharing element and could include real-time coordination using databases to manage operations. The Spectrum Access System in CBRS is a good example of that. New spectrum users are licensed, and general authorized access operators dynamically share the spectrum with incumbent operators using all 4 sharing approaches, including the time element. More recently, we're pursuing an automated frequency coordination approach for 6 gigahertz to promote dynamic sharing between incumbent licensees and unlicensed operations. Our job as spectrum managers is to be good stewards of this important resource and look for new approaches to share the spectrum in the most efficient manner. I thank you again for inviting me to participate in this event, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you. Back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Ron. That was great. And yes, I think we've all been watching as everyone builds up these portfolios from mid, low, and low, mid, and high band, which is certainly very important. And sharing obviously, applies differently in all those areas. And I agree totally. From a long time ago, satellite and microwave always shared the same allocations, and it's pretty easy to coordinate. So that's always been shared. So let's move over to NTIA. We have Charles Cooper with us. And Charles is the Associate Administrator in the Office of Spectrum Management at the NTIA, so an important player these days, and perhaps becoming more important as we know from the new infrastructure bill that's going through, or supposedly going through. He's formerly with the FCC, so a lot of background in all these areas, and I believe is author of the report on the incumbent informing capability techniques that are coming. So Charles, over to you, and look forward to an interesting talk.
Thank you, Rob, for moderating this, and certainly want to say thank you to the Spectrum Americas and also Dan Kraft for inviting me as well. It's always a pleasure to follow up with Ron, because he always kind of frames it so well. Particularly Ron, I appreciated your story about about the internet access, and particularly Wi-Fi access in aircraft. And personally, I still find it amazing. Even today, after it's been here for several years, that we're still able to get connectivity at 30,000 feet above ground level. One of the wonders of American technology and ingenuity. So I think Ron gave a very, very good background to some of the spectrum sharing techniques as we look into bands that will have potentially multiple use cases involved. My perspective is as we're marching in this direction, I think we're going to have to work and kind of work a little bit more diligently, I think, on our modeling on terms of how these systems can coexist. And what the bottom line is, we don't want harmful interference to occur, right? And harmful interference could be manifested by dropped calls if you're a carrier. Other parameters of harmful interference would be more on the federal side. If you've got a radar system, which tend to be very sensitive, they could have false targets come up. They could also have just general loss of operation there. And certainly, these radars are used by National Defense. They're used by our fellow agency within the Department of Commerce, NOAA, for radar observations, for weather observations. So they're pretty important. So there are kind of four thoughts I'd like to share with regard to how we want to think about moving the electromagnetic compatibility analysis, right? The modeling. I know it's going to get a little bit technical, but if you could kind of bear with me here. I think aggregate interference is a large one. This was discussed pretty in depth within the CBRS framework when you had, as was pointed out earlier, where you protecting military assets in the presence of potentially millions of new commercial and unlicensed devices. Trying to account for that makes a big difference in the modeling. Typically now it's pretty simplistic with algebraic summings of the values in the theoretical format. I'm kind of drawing upon my broadcast experience. Back in the AM medium wave days, there used to be an RSS, root sum square, of the aggregate emitters. So I think that's something that should be kind of looked into. Also, my second point would be looking at it from a risk-based analysis. As we're mixing different use cases, I think there has to be an understanding, maybe even ideally a single value that determines the amount of risk that a certain operation will obtain. For those of us RF engineers who may be told a little bit in the point-to-point microwave, we're used to dealing with the 5 nines or the 4 nines and determine the reliability of a fixed point-to-point, terrestrial microwave link. And that's to the point where nothing in RF is 100%, right? We can't guarantee 100% certainty in RF. And I think there has to be kind of a continued understanding of that. And as we depart from that 100%, what are the trades in that? And I think that's going to be coming into kind of a risk-based analysis. You may have heard, in the past using Monte Carlo type of analysis, et cetera. There was one similar analysis that NTA provided to the FCC with regard to, as Ron mentioned, he mentioned 5.9 gigahertz. There are some federal equities, some ground-based radars that are protected in there. And if you look at the NTI submission, we actually used in some aspects of Monte Carlo, risk-based analysis on that, which was pretty novel. So we're pretty excited about that. The third point on these electromagnetic compatibility analysis deals with the out-of-band emissions, right, of the transmitters. Historically, it hasn't been much of a concern, but if you look in the more recent cases with CBRS, particularly for the base stations, went to 2-step out-of-band emissions for the base stations, and likewise for other bands. What the NTA modeling has shown to date is principally it's not the user devices, not the handsets, looking in the terrestrial wireless role that is causing the interference for the most part, just due to the very low powers. I mean, they operate with about 1 watt effective rated power. Base stations can operate with thousands of watts of effective rated power. So I think understanding those out-of-band emissions and maybe exploring going to more of a 2-step process there. And then likewise, on the other side deals with the receiver issue, right? Because when you do electromagnetic compatibility analysis, you have to look both at the transmitters and receivers. And, there are effectively no receiver standards out there now. But yet when we do these analysis, you have to characterize the receiver performance, which is challenging to do. Again, drawing upon my experience, coming from the broadcast world many years ago, over the air, analog NTSC receivers were protected, 15 channels away. So that was 90 megahertz away from the co-channel, which was pretty extensive. And again, it was to provide the receiver protection. As technology marched on with digital television, now it's just protected on a co and adjacent channel. So the protections have really improved in the receivers, and that generally follows as well for receiver architectures. They tend to be a little bit more broad, more wide open initially, but then as later generations come on, they begin to tighten up their pass bands. So that's also one thing to consider. So just kind of summarizing with the EMC, the aggregate interference, risk-based analysis, the out-of-band emissions for transmitters, and how we're going to further consider receivers. Do we just need to prioritize some sort of receivers? I think there's a lot of interesting discussions we can have there. Before I turn it back over to you, Rob, I just do want to plug in as well for a concept that NTI developed called the Incumbent Informing Capability. That's called the IIC. Basically, it's a mechanism for reliably informing the new entrants that shared spectrum band when incumbent systems are operating. We were provided a paper earlier this year at the TPRC. It's still a concept, unfortunately. We have not received any funding, and we're still having discussions within the federal government on this. But there was a comment raised in the initial panel just about an hour or so ago that was mentioned that trying to obtain the certainty of when the spectrum would be available is critical, and I think that will kind of go a long ways to it. But hopefully you'll be hearing a lot more about that. That's called the IIC, the Incumbent Informing Capability. Thank you, Rob.
Excellent, thank you. Yes, as you said, getting a bit more technical, but actually some super important points. And I like the framework of the 4 parameters for EMC discussion. And I'm sure we'll come back to these in questions. The out-of-band emissions and the receiver standards, things like that are super important. And it sounds technical, but actually has a lot of implications. So thank you very much. And certainly the aggregate interference point, I'm sure Tim is going to be very interested in talking about that. So I think Tim is our next speaker. Yes. Okay. So Tim, welcome. And Tim is the chairman of the UWB Alliance. It's the ultra wideband dedicated to developing interoperable specifications for UWB products. Sorry, I'm reading that. and coexistence strategies. So clearly from a UWB perspective, everything has to coexist, and like these little devices here that have to sit wherever they are. I've got one in my briefcase and whatnot, have to coexist with everything else and ping me. So Tim, pass it over to you. You might have a couple more words of introduction for yourself, but go for it.
All right, very good. Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you everyone for allowing us to participate here. We're very excited to discuss these topics because sharing is at the bottom of everything that we do. With UWB, since we do exist from frequencies as low as 3 to 10 and in some places 12 gigahertz, and these are at the same time that there are other users there. So it's very near and dear to our heart is spectrum sharing. Okay, so next slide. Okay, so what are the keys to optimal spectrum sharing? One of the things that it just is right up front is device density is the most important thing. It's not range anymore. In the early days of when we were all using cell phones and there were very few cell towers out there, everybody had to fight to get as much range as possible. But as now we are starting to use these devices for everything that we do in daily life, it's become more and more important. The general tenet is high power is bad at this point, low power is good, because when you use low power, you're only using the part of the frequency in a geographical area that you need to. And to this, focused transmission when it is required is really the key. So, for example, the fixed point-to-point, where there you've got very tight focal points, and therefore you're not surrounding the entire area with an omnidirectional broadcast. Also matching the correct technologies with the types of applications that you're doing. We've got this plethora of things out there from 5G to UWB and everything in between. And if you use each one for its real design purpose, then you end up using the spectrum very, very efficiently. And then thirdly is cooperation. We work with other people with UWB. The UWB Alliance is very involved with working with both the Connected Car Consortium with FIRA, who's very involved with smartphones, Omlox, who's very involved in industrial, and all working together so that we have common themes and common requests in how we deal with the use of the spectrum that we use, because it is quite a broad area. But then also working with dissimilar technologies. So, the work that we do with Ron and his team at the FCC, being involved in Wind Forum, IEEE, the standards that we help generate, members of our group play key roles at IEEE. ETSI and CPT over in Europe, we work with them. Most of our staff are members, and we have liaison agreements with these. Next, please. And so if we look, what we see is that we use multiple radios to match technology. When we take a look at the products that have been really introduced within the past 5 years or such, what we see is here we are. We've got UWB in use in almost every one for very short range and for ranging. And then where we've got 4G LTE. And these are, being brought forward by innovative companies. Apple certainly taking the lead with iPhone 11 having UWB in it and all these different technologies combined. Samsung quickly following suit very quickly behind. Lenovo doing some interesting things where they're using it to first determine if somebody's at a seat in front of a computer before they transmit and before they determine their location. We've got all this plethora, then reaching down all the way down to AirTags and Samsung smart tags, where you can use it just to find little devices that you want. Can you find your keys? Can you find, as said earlier, just throwing it into your suitcase so you know where things are and can find them rapidly. These are very innovative uses of this. Next slide, please. So if we look at it, we say, well, goodness, I never knew UWB was in all those different devices. Why is it compelling? What is it that makes it attractive? And it really is spectrum sharing that does make it attractive. As you can see from these slides, if we look along the top half, what we see is that the way that UWB works is that it just sends out pulses, and between those pulses, it's just open space. And so it allows up to thousands of devices to be in the same area, and all of them still work. We've got, looking at it from the frequency domain, we do take a wide swath. Typically, it's 500 megahertz, although we can go from 3 to 10 to 12. The way that almost all systems are designed, they're designed so that they just use that small portion of frequency. And then we've got the, that's compared to frequency modulation, where we've got a carrier sense. And then what happens is it's taking up that bandwidth for a longer period of time. So that makes it so that we can share that area. Next slide, please. If we look at it, UWB is extremely good for spectrum efficiency. It really is 5G for IoT. It's an enabler for the Internet of Things as we're reaching out and more devices are going to be out there. Because of this fact that it's just pulses, not continuous waves, we can have so many share. Because the amount of power that's in any particular band or per megahertz is so low, currently we're at minus 41.3 dBm, the aggregate noise is virtually undetectable. These are things, this aggregate noise is something that we know is very important, and starting low and spreading it wide allows us to have virtually immeasurable aggregate noise there. Unlicensed spectrum also allows innovators to dream and design. There are literally hundreds of companies out there coming up with new uses, new things that can be done to grow the IoT and bring new facilities to everyone. And with that, I'd like to just say thank you, and thanks for giving us a few minutes to talk here.
Excellent, Tim. Thank you. I'm sure hopefully we'll come back to some of these in questions. Hopefully the 500 megahertz with pulses and 5G for IoT and things like that. This is great stuff. And then, all right, so let's move on. We're back still into the spectrum sharing, dynamic sharing, and we're going to bring up Martha Suarez. And Martha is a very accomplished background in the academic field as a PhD from the Université Paris-Est from 2009. She's worked with the regulator I believe in Colombia, ANE, where she worked as senior advisor to the Director General and supported international activities of the agency. She's been Director General there as well, and has looked at efficient uses of spectrum and mobile broadband connectivity, particularly in Colombia. And since May 2019, she's been president of the Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, a global organization advocating for laws and regulations leading to more efficient and effective spectrum utilization. So right in the topic of our panel. So over to you, Martha.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Global Forum, for the invite today. So I'm planning to use some slides as a guideline. So for this session, next slide, please. Probably could start introducing the DSA for those of you that are very much aware about our activities. So we are a global cross-industry non-for-profit organization, and we advocate for laws, regulations, and economic best practices that lead to more efficient use of the spectrum. So very much aligned with the session today. And we think that is very important because it's a way to foster innovation and also to provide affordable connectivity for all. Next slide, please. So in terms of the principles, I think that maybe that could be also a good opening for this discussion afterwards. So from the DSA perspective, we think that it's possible to have better spectrum management through technology. And that means that we are very supportive of the use of geolocation databases and other interference protection mechanisms to promote greater shared use of the spectrum. In general terms, and as a principle, we are technology neutral, and we support all shared spectrum technologies that promote coexistence. So it has been discussed before, it's very important to make sure that the technical conditions are there for sharing. And in most of the cases, they are there. And the technology has been improving and has been playing a more important role all the time for spectrum management. We recommend the consideration of license, unlicensed, and likely license frameworks. And we think that that is important because that is a way to promote more broadband penetration that is perfectly aligned with the vision of the US and what we have heard from acting chairwoman Jessica Rosenworcel. We also believe that an unbalanced approach may have consequences, like it could create an artificial scarcity. And that is a problem because spectrum is a limited resource. It doesn't have to be scarce, but it's limited. So we shouldn't create that artificial scarcity. And it's really possible in some cases to move away from the black and white perception, like just licensed, just unlicensed, and try to find good and new solutions and a good balance between different types of access to the spectrum. And we also believe that licensed and unlicensed spectrum access have a very important role to play in the delivery of 4G and advanced 5G services. Next slide, please. And I won't really take a lot of time here. I just wanted to mention that from the DSA perspective, and I think we can see it now, CBRS is a great spectrum sharing success story. It was just mentioned before in the opening session that in the previous panel that we have seen an incredible amount of new deployments for broadband access in CBRS in a very short period of time. And we are having deployments for indoor and outdoor. We are having mobile broadband, fixed wireless access, private use cases. And all of them are really positive for the ecosystem and take that challenge of a wider and complete ecosystem for 5G and for broadband access in general. One of the things that we highlight from CBRS is the fact that there were a lot of winners. And that's something that was not seen in the past. And CBRS framework is creating the conditions for those different types of users, protecting the incumbents, giving access for priority access licenses, and also giving a general authorized access. And we believe that that mix is really very, very important because you create the conditions for different types of licenses in the same band. And that creates a very good new landscape for investment. Well, some numbers that are many SaaS administrators that are authorized right now operating, and we have also different important numbers in terms of clients and CBSD models. Next slide, please. And the number of applications is very wide. I liked the reference to different, now ICT is not a vertical anymore. We use it for different sectors, transportation, healthcare, utilities, smart cities, education. And we are seeing all those deployments right now using CBRS. Next slide, please. The previous one. This is to mention that also it's about business case. I think one of the challenges from 5G is not just making sure that the technology is there, but it's finding the right business case and the right applications for users. And in this case, through spectrum sharing, we have created a good opportunity for different stakeholders to coexist. And we have then private networks, WISP, wireless internet service providers that are very important for rural deployments, neutral hosts that taking part of the investment, cable and consumers, and traditional wireless, of course, companies that find a very useful access to this band to increase their capacity, the capacity of their networks. Next slide, please. And also, I would like to refer to the success we are seeing right now in the global momentum we are seeing for spectrum sharing in the 6 gigahertz band. So in this case, there are incumbents already using the band, fixed services, fixed satellite services, mobile, there is a mobile allocation. And on top of that, at the same time, it's possible to have Wi-Fi access and in general unlicensed access. So this is great in terms of spectrum sharing. For the outdoor applications, we can have automated frequency coordinations, and for very low power and low power indoors, we can have coexistence rules that guarantee that incumbents are protected. So we are seeing in the Americas a great acceptance. We have more than 8 administrations right now and expecting others to make a decision soon. And yeah, I think that's following the US leadership that was the first country adopting the decision. And now in North America, well, Mexico already had 2 consultations on the subject, and we have the final decisions from Canada and US. So I will stop with my introduction remarks here, and very glad and looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. And that's certainly a good lead into to our next topic on the CBRS discussion. And certainly this question, I'm sure some of these questions will come back, hopefully, on questions of scarcity, licensed versus unlicensed, and sort of the global positioning around these things, which is really interesting. So let's bring up our last speaker, which is Patrick Welsh. I'm sure he doesn't need much introduction to anyone. And in fact, on the website, there's no bio. So I'll let Patrick introduce himself. I will note, though, I believe you're vice president as opposed to director. Is that correct? Maybe
That's
I'll
correct.
pass it over to you. All right. So over to Patrick Welsh from Verizon. We're looking forward to hearing about CBRS and all the good things Verizon's doing.
Thanks, Rob. So I know folks are eager to ask some questions, so I'll keep my introductory comments brief. But I do want to touch on a handful of things. First, we've had a tremendous success here in the United States with the framework on spectrum access. First with unlicensed, and then with flexible use licenses. But we're moving into a new category, which is shared spectrum. And this is really when we're mixing uses, like commercial uses with federal uses. And I think a great example has been the CBRS band. While it's still early, we're very optimistic about the success of this band. Verizon was the largest winner of PAL licenses in last year's auction. But we're also deploying very aggressively both PAL and GAA uses. But what's important to think about as we're thinking about spectrum sharing with federal users is you need to be able to share information about the different systems there, and I think that's one of the lagging characteristics or lagging problems as we talk about spectrum sharing is there isn't right now a solid framework to exchange that information, and that really. That needs to be a focus going forward. We're optimistic about the incumbent informing capability that Charles touched on. Right now, the CBRS band relies on spectrum sensing of Navy radar systems, and while that works, you have to remember that spectrum sensing is a use. And so the commercial availability of spectrum around these sensing sites is reduced because those sensors have to listen for the Navy radar systems. And the incumbent informing capability of updating a database kind of addresses that problem. And so we look forward to working with NTIA and the federal agencies, hopefully in the future, on setting up this new capability. The last thing I just want to touch on is we always have to remember that spectrum sharing isn't an end in and of itself. It's a way of making sure that we're using spectrum efficiently. So we don't want to give up on models like the traditional Part 15 unlicensed regime or the exclusive flexible use models that are really the backbone of today's 4G and 5G networks. But we do have to be creative going forward and looking at these new models like CBRS to try to unlock additional capacity and really create that win-win situation that we're seeing in the early days of CBRS. So Rob, I think I'll stop there and we can start with the questions from the audience.
All right, thank you, Patrick. Short and sweet, and I'm sure we'll come back to some of those points. So actually, we do have I've got a boatload of questions, but you know, a lot of these topics lead into all kinds of areas. So, but we'll go with the questions from the audience. We have 3. I think 2 are fairly related, but I guess the first one, I'll read it and then we can pass it to whoever wants to talk. But I think it's probably mostly an NTIA kind of question to start with. But question: is enforcement of interference and spectrum rights a private or a government function? And that's from NAB Rob Weller. Now, Rob, I'm not sure exactly if that's a leading question or not, but Charles, do you want to start us off on that one?
Well, I would accept. I would like to see if Ron, because I think
Already passing the
I think
buck.
that deals more with with an enforcement issue, which the FCC has a enforcement bureau. So Ron, before I say anything, I'd like to give you an opportunity there.
Certainly, and I'll start with spectrum allocations. So spectrum allocations confer rights and responsibilities when it comes to protecting incumbents and adjacent users from potential harmful interference. And I'd say potential because that's the order of business at the commission, right? To come up with a regulatory and technical framework for spectrum sharing that reduces, or in some cases to a point where it's near zero, the risk of interference to incumbent users, right? So for any unforeseen instances where there is actual interference, as Charles pointed out, and he was part of the Enforcement Bureau when he was with the commission, we do have processes in place to deal with the unforeseen issues of interference. And not all complaints that come to the commission are interference, right? There could be a disruption to a network operation that's unrelated to interference. It could be related to other challenges that network operators deal with on a daily basis. It could be interactions with other licensees in adjacent markets that have co-primary rights on that same spectrum. So first order of business would be to mitigate the risk of interference from a potential standpoint and have mechanisms in place to deal with interference should it occur in an unforeseen fashion.
Okay. Sounds like a bit of interference on the call here, but yeah, okay, well, that makes sense. And it's true, yeah, the FCC does have an enforcement bureau, so I guess that kind of self-answers that question in a sense. But there's a related one, and since we're on Ron and Charles, let me go to that one next, and we'll come back to some of the other points. And I'm not sure if someone has a microphone on that's causing noise there. Hopefully it's not me. Who will be orchestrating the spectrum sharing process, and what measures will you take to avoid any possible interference? Maybe this goes to Charles first with his 4 parameters there, but what key message would you give to other national regulatory authorities looking to implement sharing? So again, I directed to Charles and Ron, if you want to take that one on between the two of you.
Sure, I'll lead off here, and then it can follow up there as well. But the FCC and NTIA have work as co-regulators, right? We have a very close working relationship. Ron's on my speed dial, right? And we coordinate a lot of issues. And furthermore, we even have this memorialized in a memorandum of understanding MOU between the FCC and NTIA that gives certain time stamps for us to coordinate documents on either side as well. And just to date, I think we've probably coordinated on the order of 13 or so with the FCC. And furthermore, NTIA has actually submitted comments on behalf of the federal agencies in the executive branch into the FCC proceedings on approximately a half a dozen proceedings, 6 of those proceedings. So the point being is that it takes a lot of collaboration, both on a policy perspective, but also an engineering perspective. I would suggest to make sure, because to follow up on a point of Ron said, once it gets to the Interference Bureau at the FCC, we hope that's, if it is an actual interference case, we hope it tends to be a corner case. If it's widespread interference, it's possibly suggesting that there may be a greater policy issue that occurred. But the corner cases, I think, can generally be handled. We don't want to widespread harmful interference because, number one, it's difficult to unravel. And number 2, it points to a possible policy, maybe even a policy failure as well. So that's why the engineers take this very critical analysis, and why, in my opening remarks, why the EMC analysis are so critical in these shared bands. Because if you look, historically, through the exclusive allocations, right, you had kind of like-minded services grouped together, either the passive services or the land mobile services or the telecommunication services. And when you begin intermingling the two, it becomes a lot more challenging because they may have different thresholds of what harmful interference is. And a great example of this is the 5 gigahertz unlicensed band, right? You've got unlicensed devices being shared with federal radar systems. So the federal radar systems, of course, have a much tighter harmful interference threshold than the unlicensed devices, which essentially have to accept all interference. So it's making sure that those can be interleaved and the proper harmful interference thresholds established is critical. Thank you.
Okay, that makes sense. Ron, did you have something to add to that, or is it?
Only to bring up a couple of points that actually, Charles, you had brought up in your opening remarks. It has to go with the risk-informed approach to EMC compatibility, right? So if we're talking about incumbent operations that have zero risk for potential interference, that sets the stage for one approach to determining potential spectrum repurposing activities. If that risk is not zero, it's some other threshold. We need to understand what that threshold is, do the technical and engineering analyses that are necessary to assess that risk, and then move forward with the regulatory framework and hopefully ultimate repurposing the spectrum, whether it's for exclusive use or for shared use.
Okay, well, that makes sense. I think that's part of the question too, I think, was related to what should other, regulatory authorities around the world look to. And I think you're providing some good framework around the NTI FCC around that. But I guess, it's Charles's discussion earlier about the 4 elements of EMC, is it a lot related to out-of-band emissions and receiver definitions as opposed, like we hear about offshore, we run into the problem of planes landing, right? And they say, well, okay, we're 500 megahertz away, but we're going to get interference. So is that an out-of-band emission problem? What is the issue there? And how should other, we haven't heard so much about that in the US, but elsewhere we've heard that a lot. And Charles, you don't want to answer that, right?
I'll go ahead. I'll
go for it, Ron. Okay.
Understanding the incumbencies, not just those that are on the spectrum that you're looking to repurpose and analyze, but also the adjacencies. And that's a very difficult point to address sometimes, because in the FCC's record, we don't always have information about the receivers that are in the adjacent spectrum. So we have to make some initial cuts on what the interference tolerances are with respect to the incumbents, whether they're in the spectrum or the adjacent band. Propagation analysis is also, modeling is also very important. I know that there's a lot of work that's going on in the industry and in the federal government to look at the propagation models that are used for these interference analyses to make sure that the assumptions and the methodologies are appropriate for given use cases. Think, for example, if the incumbents are a Navy ship on the water versus in the port, where you might have clutter between the radar receivers that's on the ship and the transmitters that might be several kilometers offshore. That propagation model is a very key aspect to determining the potential for interference, and also from the incumbent's perspective, what is the risk of interference that I might receive given different use cases. So that's one thing that I would suggest looking at, as well as the propagation modeling, and if there's further work that could be done to refine the assumptions that would go into those different models.
All right, makes sense. Now we have there's a couple more questions that kind of on that same theme, but I think I'd like to shift a bit and go back to a different question, give Tim and Martha and Patrick a chance on some different questions. So I think this is a good one for Martha maybe to start us off on. Okay, how does dynamic spectrum sharing work when one of the users in the band is passive and cannot report back on interference? How would this affect the reliability of the passive service? And that's from Haz at Intelsat. So if you want to take a shot at that, Martha, to start, and Tim, you may have some opinions on that, and maybe even Patrick, relative to coordination and things. Go for it.
Yeah, thank you, Rob. And I think I will make the link with what Ron and Charles were just saying. One aspect is that for spectrum sharing is not one magic solution for all the bands. It's really case by case. So my first comment here is that it really depends on the technologies and the frequency band you are considering. There is no one solution that fits all. And then you could have sharing using in time, in frequency, and in location, so in geography. And you can have a combination of those. So I think depending on the incumbent services, the first principle is they should be protected. You cannot have a reliable dynamic spectrum access system if you don't have protection of the incumbents. And then you start considering what measures of protection they need. And then on that, you can design the rules and then the aspects for enforcement of an external coordination mechanism. So it could be, there are some cases where you can have part of it by rules, and then you have a combination with an external automated frequency coordination systems or a SAS or an IAC. It depends on the name we want to consider for that, but that is basically the principle. So I wouldn't say that there is a magic solution. It has to be considered case by case. And that would be also an advice for regulators from other countries that are considering spectrum sharing. It's like, you should start from the technical perspective. Solutions are there, but you should start by that, making sure that you understand which are the trends and which are the benefits for that analysis.
Okay, sounds good. Tim, is that something that you can opine on? What about passive devices? And
well, I think when it comes to passive devices, I think that's where my point about having the right technology is so key, because maybe that device is not two-way, as in it's a passive device, but it can be attached to other devices which are able to make long-range contact and therefore make notification of interference. And even just knowing via maybe a radar-type device that there's other devices out there. So I think, again, it comes down to the application matching and using the right technology for each application.
Okay, makes sense. Patrick, any input from Verizon on this? I guess you mentioned deployment of PAL and GAA. There's a whole mixture of things in that range. So,
yeah, I think one thing to keep in mind is, at least as we introduce commercial uses into historically, federal-only bands, that we do have the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act of 2003. That allows for the new entrants to pay for either relocating the incumbents, but more importantly in this context, of upgrading their systems to facilitate spectrum sharing. So this develops kind of a virtuous cycle where new entrant can come in, they can protect the incumbent, and they can pay for new equipment that allows the incumbent to continue to operate. But in a much more spectrum efficient manner. And I think that's one of the key components that we have to remember is when we're talking about harmful interference, it could be that the receivers are outdated, they're old, they lack proper filtering. So there is a mechanism, at least with federal bands, of upgrading those systems to promote and facilitate spectrum sharing.
Okay, makes sense. I guess I'm sorry, I'm going to echo there. Is there a related question from the audience that maybe, Patrick, you still can add to? How does enforcement work in this context then? If we go back to that, I know we don't get too much back into the enforcement point, but what does enforcement look like in dynamic spectrum management? So is there an implication for the SAS, for example, or you just mentioned out-of-date receivers and things like that? Does the SAS have a role to play in there or other mechanisms like that?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, spectrum management is only effective spectrum management is only as good as spectrum enforcement. And so we have that closed loop system in the the CBRS band with the spectrum access system. We have partial enforcement regime in the 6 gigahertz band. The AFC is required for outdoor uses. Verizon and some of the other microwave operators in that band, we're pretty vocal during the rulemaking to make sure that we had a closed loop system, both for the outdoor higher power uses, but also for indoor. And the reason for that is you can't stop harmful interference if you don't know who's causing it. So we thought the AFC, a lightweight AFC, was really the right approach, for all of that spectrum.
Okay. Okay, no, that makes sense. And actually, we're getting a lot of echo again. Sorry. So we have another question from that kind of relates a bit to that too, and I'll let whoever wants to get into it. But this sort of high power, low power is obviously one of the main issues of spectrum sharing. So Brent Skorup sent us a question here. So for a century, I don't know if he measured that exactly, but for a century, private and public spectrum managers have repurposed spectrum bands for new wireless uses. That's true. How will regulators in the future repurpose today's dynamic sharing bands, which are typically low power, for new technologies, in particular when they're high power? So I don't know who wants to start on that, but that's obviously a major element of the sharing point. Someone want to start on that? Tim, you're the power guy, no? High
Well,
power, low power.
yeah, well, I think breaking things into smaller and smaller cells as the cost of hardware has gone down and continues to move quickly down. Just smaller and smaller cells just gives more and more users access to the band. And I think that's going to be key as we move forward, is reductions in power rather than increases in power.
Okay, that makes sense. I guess just on the question too, and yeah, maybe Martha, you should be up on this, but in the dynamic sharing context, and it says typically low power. Now, I guess when we think of CBRS, I guess you can think of that as dynamic sharing, but I didn't think that the low power aspect of CBRS was related to the sharing. Am I wrong? Or anyway, Martha, do you want to add to that? I mean,
what I wanted to say was more about the question itself.
Sure.
It's like I think we are so used to say we need to go through a clearance process that we assume that is always the right solution. And I think in many cases, the fact that you implement dynamic spectrum access has many benefits. Like you can have immediate access to the spectrum. I mean, compared to it can be comparable. Once you have the experience of the framework, that could be faster. But going through a clearance process takes a lot of time. It's expensive. There are complications. And you have to decide which users have the right to stay or not. If you have a spectrum sharing, you can keep those incumbents and at the same time have access to the broadband to spectrum. Also, you can have a mechanism where you know where the users are, and then it will be easier to implement any type of enforcement as indicated. And it's very transparent. So you can also facilitate transactions between the users. So I guess that instead of saying, I mean, it's just a question probably, and it's worth thinking about it. Why do we need to go always through a clearance process? If it's possible to have a spectrum sharing, and if we find the right conditions, then it should become the new norm, instead of trying to consider it like we should always spend time and money in clearance process.
Yeah, Rob, if I could jump in.
Absolutely.
CBRS is a great example of this question of high and low power. The CBRS band is relatively low power because the original analysis was done to protect Navy radar systems with a static analysis. So you had very large exclusion zones along the coast. As we worked in the record to refine that, we moved from that static exclusion zones to these dynamic protection areas, but unfortunately, we were so far along in the process, we never revisited the possibility of increasing power for CBRS. So, we have to remember that, power levels are architectural decisions, and artificially keeping power levels low has, broad impact for deployment. So, it really should be, higher power levels should be the default, and the licensees and the users can then make decisions on what the right, spectrum use is for that particular band.
Yeah, and I think there's certainly there's a lot of echo again. There's a lot of history around the CBRS and how it evolved from the original concept, which is why I was wondering the linkage back to the dynamic sharing. Like there's I didn't really pick up a direct linkage between the sharing mechanism and the power. I mean, other than, as you said, the proximity to the fixed exclusion zones was part of it. But technically for the sharing, I don't, and isn't CBRS also, isn't there some talk of increasing the power levels so that it's more consistent across the mid-range? Yeah.
I mean, there have been. I mean, you have CBRS that's kind of sandwiched between C-band and the 3.45. So I think there probably is an opportunity to kind of streamline some of the power limits and out-of-band emission limits. and frankly, the SAS are more than capable of accommodating a mix of higher and lower power in CBRS.
So Rob, a final comment. I just was thinking about spectrum sharing, not only in CBRS, but also in other bands. And I have heard an argument that says you could have a pollution of a band if you enable unlicensed access, for example. And I think that is also a misconception, because it's not like we are not using sometimes a spectrum sharing as something that should be for a while, and then you come back to the previous model. That's why it takes time and discussions. Once you decide on a framework, like, for example, the decision for the 6 gigahertz for unlicensed access in the US, that is creating the conditions for a large ecosystem on a non-protection, non-interference basis. And I don't see a reason then to consider that you should clean that band in the future for other high-power applications.
Okay.
Well, Robert, I think within that scope, one of the things also that was touched on earlier is out-of-bands emissions, and that is the aggregate power goes up when you have sloppiness in terms of how much out-of-band you allow, and that's one of the great places to be able to win lots of spectrum to be shared by many, many people by making those. I mean, today's filters can do a much better job than in some cases they might actually be required to do, and as innovators even clean it up themselves, the actual users, even in unlicensed bands where they choose, where the rules may say one thing, but they actually do a better job than that by being careful to design a system both at the transmit and receive side so that the out-of-band emissions is reduced to a minimum.
Okay, makes sense. I guess I
would just add, if I may, about the power levels. I think I think we would all agree here too about. I think the point was raised. It might have been by Tim, by focusing the energy to the end user, right? So having higher power across the board doesn't necessarily solve the problem of trying to maximize the energy to the end user to get the low latency, high data rate applications that the consumers are demanding, right? So you have to be a little more focused in that respect. And back to the propagation modeling and so forth, and the interference modeling, how do you model those type of advanced antenna systems is something that needs to be thought through pretty carefully as well, when not just from the interference risk standpoint, but also from the adjacency, from the what's going on in the adjacency standpoint as well. So I think those are things we need to take into account from a spectrum regulatory perspective.
Okay, anyone else? I think we're pretty much close to running out of time, so I don't know if anyone else had it. Tim, do you want to just add another point on that, or?
No, I agree with Ron.
Okay. Okay, no, we end on a high power note. I mean, that's great, and it's certainly one of the key issues in sharing. And thank you all for the good discussion around all the different points. Some a bit more technical and some less, and I think it's been an excellent discussion. Hopefully, the audience appreciated it. We've got some good questions, so just thank you all very much, and we'll pass it back over to Dan.
Rob, thank you. And to echo that, it's an excellent discussion. And I think some really, really interesting topics raised. And I think, definitely lots of questions from the audience, which obviously shows there was a really good level of interest in all that as well. So thank you all very much. Thank you to all of our panelists for that. Thank you, Rob, to you for moderating that session so well. So really interesting session again. So thank you all very much for that. So we've had two fascinating sessions so far. We're now going to have a short break for 45 minutes or so a chance to go and grab some lunch. And then we're back this afternoon with our... sorry, Charles, bring you up again. We're back this afternoon with 4 more sessions. We've got a busy day overall. So in 45 minutes or so, the next session that we're going to have back here on the main stage is going to be looking at private 5G networks. Of course, CBRS, which we've been talking about in that sharing session, is one of the bands that's being used for that in the US. So it'll be interesting to look at how that's brought in. But looking at different access mechanisms, spectrum bands, and different business models. We're then going to switch and focus specifically on the space and satellite sector. So one sector that there's been a huge amount of innovative new market entrants, I suppose, over the last few years, and a big change in the way that the spectrum is accessed in the sector. So it'll be interesting to have a session looking at that, focusing specifically on the satellite and space sector. And then we finish off today with 2 sessions focusing on delivering universal service on RDOF, and then a more general session looking across the region at best way forward to deliver affordable and universal broadband across the region, as I say. So that's all coming up. So we have a 45-minute break now. So please do, once again, without wanting to sound like a broken record, please do go and check out our sessions in the on-demand area. There are some really fascinating discussions looking at some of the issues we've been covering already, and a lot more there as well. So please do go and check those out. And we'll be back here again on the main stage in 45 minutes. For now, thank you very much to all of our panelists and speakers for this morning's sessions. Thanks to all you out there, and we'll see you back here in 45 minutes. Thank you.